Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about the most interesting areas, zones in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires as things currently stand. I've talked about the worst zones, let's talk about the best and most interesting zones. The zones where if you start a legendary lord that is located in one of these areas, one of these zones, you are going to have a much better campaign experience overall. And it's not just because these zones generally will end up having an easier campaign, it's far from it. It's because the way these zones are designed can lead to a better, more dynamic, more interesting campaign experience overall, as opposed to the heartburn of something like the Southlands. And I think that's really what these zones are all about, creating good campaign experiences. And let's start with Ulfon, because Ulfon has generally been one of the better areas, zones in Total War since it was introduced in Warhammer 2. It's a fairly large area that's in the middle of the ocean, not the middle of the map anymore, but the middle of the ocean that does have quite a lot of potential in terms of expansion, though it also has a large number of potential enemies, at least at the start. There's plenty of elven factions and there's been more factions added in. Noctilus is going to be an immediate threat for Tyrion to deal with after he deals with the Dark Elves taking most of the Etain province, and he having to beat them back. But he's going to have to deal with Count Noctilus, he's going to have to deal with the Vampire Coast. You already have two legendary lords in conflict with one another, and he also has Tyrion also has an issue with Terranok, Alarion, the situation between the two, because Alarion and Terranok don't particularly like each other. Which side of the coin you're going to stand on depends on you. Then there's of course Everest with their Orc Rebellion, if you do decide to play Elfarion and play an Everest campaign as Elfarion. Alariel in the northern part, and Nakari even further north. Now Ulfon, being an island in the middle of the ocean, does create a sense of safety from outside powers, because even though factions can and will eventually attack Ulfon, like Morathi from the west, Bretonia potentially if you piss them off, Be'lakor and so on, it is also relatively safe. You're not going to see swarms and swarms of enemies just raiding your provinces. Instead, when someone attacks Ulfon, they're doing so in overwhelming force, because that's how the AI works when it's talking about crossing the ocean. It's not going to do so with just a couple of smaller armies just to raid you and harass you and frustrate you. It's going to give you a fight, a serious fight on your hands when it decides to do that from outside of Ulfon, which makes those fights more meaningful and makes them more interesting, as opposed to having to chase down constantly forces of raiders. A campaign is more interesting when you do have those kind of forces. The initial fights can be somewhat predictable, I suppose, in a way, though there are quite a lot of things that can happen. There's certainly a dynamic experience. For instance, I played the campaign as Noctilus and I took Calador, and then I found it really hard to expand, because one of the things you may want to do as Noctilus is take out Tyrion, but taking out Elven settlements as the Vampire Coast can be difficult early on. So instead I did decide to do something different. I gave Calador, which you can take within the first couple of turns as Noctilus, I gave it all to Tyrion. And I gave Avafir as well to Tyrion. And he became one of my best buddies, and we went on a campaign of conquest together with Alariel, who is friendly to Tyrion and thus became friendly to me. We went on a campaign of conquest, conquered the rest of the island, and even though relations are breaking down in that particular campaign, it was certainly something outside the norm. The unholy alliance between Noctilus, Tyrion, and Alariel, which lasted for quite a fairly decent length of time. There is potential. There's a lot of ways a campaign can go in Ulfon, regardless of the legendary lord you're playing, be it Tyrion, Alariel, Noctilus, Elfarion, Nakari. All of them have options, without any of those options resulting in complete and utter disaster, without having the genuine frustration that you can experience in some other areas because of the unpredictable nature of those areas. There is an element, there is certainly an unpredictable element to an Ulfon campaign. You never know who's going to come from outside of it eventually, but there's a lot of fun to be had as well. I also think what makes Ulfon work is the way the map is set out. So to go from the outer part of Ulfon to the inner part, you pretty much either have to go via the sea from the south and go past Lothern. Good luck with that. If Tyrion doesn't like you, he's going to create a lot of issues for you like that. Lothern in particular is heavily defended. It's one of the most heavily defended settlements in the entire game, has a really strong garrison, as it should. Or you can take one of the gate paths, which are also incredibly well defended settlements. And that can create an interesting campaign experience as well, because if you're expanding in Wolf 1, you always have to be mindful of the fact that in the northern part in particular, you do have these gates, and these gates create a vulnerability for you. You can take them out, but that can be a difficult battle that can sap your strength, or you can ignore them but leave yourself vulnerable as you're conquering the outer part or the inner part, depending on who you're playing. Leave yourself vulnerable to attacks from the other side. And I feel that is an element that does make things a bit more interesting, as you are risking a bit. It only is with these areas, these 4 gates, Eagle Gate, Griffin Gate, Unicorn Gate, and Phoenix Gate, absolutely. And then there's also the Sword of Cain, which a lot of people may want. Quite a lot of people may want to get their hands on the Sword of Cain, to get that powerhouse of an item available to their campaign. Personally, I've never cared much for it. I've played a lot of Warhammer 2 and 3, and I admit I've never cared much for getting the Sword of Cain. Yeah, it has a lot of positives, but it also has quite a few downsides associated with it as well. All the same, yeah, Wolf 1 is in a good spot. It's been shrunk. It was shrunk in Mortal Empires. It feels like it's been shrunk a bit from Mortal Empires to Immortal Empires, but it's still a pretty good chunk of the map. It's a good place to start an empire if you can deal with the climate. Very few people actually can deal with the climate of Wolf 1, which makes it unapproachable for a lot of factions. But if you can play a campaign in Wolf 1, you'll find it a pretty fun experience. Now at number 4, we have the Chaos Wastes. Both the Southern Chaos Wastes, as I'm showing them right here, and of course the Northern Chaos Wastes. Ignore the lag for a moment. The Northern Chaos Wastes over here is certainly something to say that the literal hell of the Warhammer fantasy world is one of the best area zones in the game, be it north or south. Though in the case of Wolf 1, what makes Wolf 1 fun is that, yeah, you're in the center, you have flexibility, but you also have that in the Chaos Wastes. So it is a lot more safe, to be clear, if you're playing a campaign in Chaos Wastes. It's a lot easier unless you're playing the Demon Prince, who is completely broken as a Legendary Lord right now. It just doesn't work all that well. But if you're playing Malice Darkblade or Archeon or Kolek even, they all start in the Chaos Wastes. It is a fairly large part of the map when you're thinking of the Chaos Wastes. Like, let's say the Chaos Wastes, the northern ones start from the Red Wastes all the way here in the Iron Frost Glacier. So lots and lots of territory to talk about when we're talking about the Chaos Wastes. An enormous amount, an enormous swath of territory to talk about. The south is nowhere near as large, but that means you do have flexibility with your campaigns. You could just expand continuously across the Chaos Wastes, getting a lot of territory, and that could pretty much be your entire campaign. Or at one point you can decide, you know, let's go somewhere else. Like for instance, as Malice Darkblade, you can conquer your initial province, deal with the Daniel Demon Prince, and then just head on to Norska to conquer it, to conquer all of it, really. Or you could go to the east to deal with Boris potentially, or more likely deal with Archeon, maybe make an alliance with Boris. There are choices to be made, decisions to be had when you are playing a campaign in the Chaos Wastes. It's very large, it's safe, so it means you can build a very, very large and expansive core to your empire, though you might believe yourself a bit vulnerable. Generally, though, it is across the sea, so factions will not necessarily make the trek into the Chaos Wastes, and it's fairly unpleasant climate as well for them if they do take it, so it's going to be hard for them to even keep the Chaos Wastes. But if you can deal with that, if you can settle in the Chaos Wastes, you're going to have a generally good and easy campaign experience. With the possibilities of expanding across various portions of the map, dependent on where you start and where you are expanding. Yeah, it says a lot about where Warhammer 3 is right now, that hell itself is one of the best zones, areas of the entire game. At number 3, we have Norska, which actually shares many features with the Chaos Wastes, in that it's relatively safe and pretty good as a starting area if you want to get a massive empire across the map. Build an economy there, and then go expand across the rest of the world. However, I would say Norska is in a better state because there are actual challenges to be had here, unlike the pathetic demon factions that may litter in the Chaos Waste that are very easy to take down because they just don't have the economy and support structure to support large armies to take you on. The Norskans can build really powerful armies that can take you on and will regularly do so. And I guess that's what makes it more interesting. And you're also far more vulnerable to attacks. Like Bretonnia generally will come for a Norskan faction. If you're playing as Be'lakor or Wulfric, do expect to see a Leon occur in quite a lot of your campaigns going for your territory. Or Marienburg may come for you. Or some other factions can and will pose threats to you, including Malice Darkblade, who does start in the Chaos Wastes. So there are challenges, and it kind of manages a balance just right between having a territory that's safe enough and far away enough from other factions that you're not constantly facing the non-stop frustration or the circus that some of the worst areas face of non-stop raiding and minor inconsequential battles, but at the same time still providing a decent enough challenge for someone playing a campaign in it. Because there are legendary lords with quite a bit of power in it. Like the Norskan legendary lords are pretty good. Be'lakor is one of the strongest in the game, and Azazel is certainly no slouch. That's the 4 legendary lords that start there, and if Malice Darkblade decides to join the fray, that's 5, and he certainly can be very scary in the early game because he does start with the Black Arc. He's going to be able to get a lot of units very quickly, and he is a really powerful force in a battle. But yeah, there are many ways a Norskan campaign in the early game can be interesting without descending into farce, which is something that does plague some of the worst areas in the game. I would also say it's certainly served by the mechanics of the Norskans themselves or the Warriors of Chaos. The Norskans confederating with factions if they just take out their leader, just taking all of their territory. So for instance, I took the Trollfjord just by defeating my initial challenge, and now if I could take down this army right here, I'd get all of this territory without having to fight those minor settlement battles. That is a godsend. Or if you're playing as Azazel, you can get vassals by taking certain key settlements like the Forbidden Citadel, taking the Dark Fortresses, especially the ones that are associated with certain vassals. So you don't have the frustration here because of the factions that are in this area do call this area home, be it Be'lakor, Azazel, Wulfric, or Trog. You don't have the frustration of non-stop minor settlement battles that end up being largely inconsequential. You can avoid actually quite a bit of that, especially if you're playing a Norskan faction, but even as a Warriors of Chaos. But Warriors of Chaos are so powerful anyway, it doesn't really matter. All the same, you'll be able to resolve your way through this with relative ease as either Azazel or Be'lakor, even on the highest possible difficulty of the game, and only have to fight the actual consequential battles, the ones against full armies, not the inconsequential minor settlement battles. Those won't really matter. It is a decent. I think it's just like in a right spot between challenge, between providing a sense of challenge without descending into the circus, as I've mentioned before, like the Empire or Kislev or the Southlands. And at number 2, we have Grand Cafe, where Creative Assembly had a great deal of flexibility in designing it, and they did a pretty good job as far as I'm concerned. In fact, Cafe would be in the minds of a lot of people the best zone area of the entire game. It's pretty large, but also diverse. So you have the deserts of the north with the Great Bastion protecting against the invading Norskans and Chaos Warriors from the Chaos Waste. So you do have the extension of the Chaos Waste there in the north. Then you have the desert, the capital of Cafe in Weijin, the coastline over there, the mountains in central Cafe in Kunlan, and then, well, the western provinces, the riverlands, and descending all the way into the southern jungles where Nakai is. So you have a great deal of diversity of terrain, design, desert, riverlands, jungle, coastline, Chaos Wastes, all in a single area of the campaign map. It is a fairly large area, to be very clear, But it is certainly well designed. It's interesting. It's fun. It's safe, of course. The eastern side, well, there's no one that's going to be coming from the eastern side. They can't use sea lanes. As for the western side, the ogres are not necessarily going to descend from the mountains, so to speak. And even if they do, they're not going to pose such a significant threat that they're going to wipe you out. Gorse might be one of your biggest problems, but even then, not necessarily so. If you're playing a Legendary Lord in Cafe, you know what you're going to deal with. You're going to deal with all your initial provinces, deal with the other Legendary Lords that start here, be it Miao Ying, Snitch, the Blessed Dread, the Western Provinces, Nakai, the Wood Elves as well, though the Wood Elves there are something you're going to want to deal with. And that will be it. There will no longer be other threats. And of course the Cast Warriors in the north. Village in particular. But that will be it. There is no endgame crisis that currently happens here except the Wood Elves and the jungles in the far south. But that's pretty much the only threat you're going to deal with in the endgame, which allows you to expand across the rest of the world fairly securely if you are playing as Grand Cafe or any of the factions that start in here. If there is a downside, then this is the reason why I don't rank it higher on this list, why I'm not giving it the #1 spot. In terms of design, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of diversity, it is really good. However, it is far too easy. I'm sorry, it's far too easy to be so interesting. Yes, the campaign starts, in particular, Snitch can be a challenge, true. But once you deal with that, then there's plenty of of challenges in early campaigns for a lot of Legendary Lords. But once you get past that, if you have it in the first place, like Miao Ying doesn't have it, or Zhang Ming, they don't have it. The two Cafe and Legendary Lords do not have that issue. But once you get past that initial challenge, is pretty much smooth sailing in steamroller mode from there. Not because the Legendary Lords that start here are really good, though Snitch is pretty solid. In his own right, he is the best Skaven Legendary Lord, and Village is a powerhouse. But not because they're so powerful as to steamroll the map on their power alone, but because they can get a good core of territory, and that's never gonna be threatened ever again, with the exception of the Wood Elf endgame crisis, which you can turn off anyway when you start the campaign. Outside of that, yeah, you're gonna have a great deal of smooth sailing after that without any genuine risk to your core territory, and that can make things boring later on. And that's why I deduct some critical points from Cafe and prevent them from taking that #1 spot, because it's just too safe. Even Ulfon, which is an island in the middle of the ocean, or the Chaos Waste do have risk. Norska has risk. Cafe has 0 once you get past the early game, with the exception of a particular endgame crisis, which it's not even going to be that big of an issue because it's only one faction that's going to spawn a couple of armies, and you can easily deal with them if you have 2 stacks or so of troops ready to receive them, and you know in advance it's coming. So at #1, it is Lustria. It doesn't have the same kind of diversity of terrain and design that Cafe does boast, but it's still in a pretty good space, I feel. Lustria has gone from being the Thunderdome to being the best area in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. This is what happens when you take a very crowded area, take a lot of those Legendary Lords, move them elsewhere, and make the campaign ultimately better. A bit too easy for some of these Legendary Lords, though there's still a decent level of challenge with the Lizardmen, specifically Itza and the Cult of Sotik over here in the south, presenting a united front, so to speak, or it's close to a united front anyway, for anyone that dares challenge them. But yeah, you do have a decent amount of Legendary Lords here. You do have 2 Lizardmen, 3 if you count Mazdamundi over in the north, though he's generally going to be stuck in the north dealing with orcs, the Norskans and all that, for a decent amount of time, if not with Morathi. You have Rakarth, you have Alberic being moved here, actually being made a useful Legendary Lord for once. A campaign start does have a significant impact on how good or bad the campaign may be, and Alberic being moved here from Bretonnia has certainly made his campaign one of the better Bretonnian campaigns that does exist there. Yes. Marcus Wolfhard is certainly benefiting significantly from the lack of opposition that he's going to face, though, even if he ends up fighting Rakarth. So it is a much better situation overall for pretty much everyone involved in a campaign in Lustria. There's a decent level of challenge, and there are obviously threats not too far away, be it in the Southlands. I mean, Arkhan the Black is not necessarily too far away over here, and Rapance not too far away. Or to the north, you do have Morathi and all the problems that come with facing Morathi. And of course, ulfon itself is relatively accessible if you do decide to play a campaign in Lustria and conquer it. So you can get a really good start, conquer a good amount of territory, only have potentially the dwarves as an endgame crisis, but that would be about it. Nothing else really to tackle at the moment. That could be very well be subject to change, as Creative Assembly has stated that they will add more endgame crises in the game. I hope they change the way they work, because right now it's not exactly in the best possible way handled, I feel. But yeah, Lustria is in a great spot. Like, you do have a decent number of foes, a good level of challenge, but you also have a good level of safety. So it gets that balance between safety and challenge just right, I feel. Like, you conquer the territory, you're pretty safe, of course, but you're not so safe like in Cafe, where you just ignore the rest of the world and win. You do have issues, you do have threats that will come for you, because ulfon is fairly close by to the northern part of Lustria, and the Southlands is fairly close by in the southern part of Lustria. And of course, you do have the Chaos Waste and Oxyotl as well to give you a good thrashing if you so desire. If you end up going that far south and he's pissed at you because you wiped out the other Lizardmen factions. So it is safe, but at the same time it creates a decent amount of challenge, and there is flexibility there. There can be a great deal of dynamic campaigns being played in Lustria. Lots of choices, lots of paths available around here. Interesting ones at that, from the coast to coast, from north to south, from west to east. Lustria has a lot of things to like right now, and I think it always was considered a far worse zone than it actually ever really was. I mean, I understand that people disliked having so many legendary lords in Lustria and Warhammer 2, but it was still much better in a lot of ways than other zones that did exist in the game. And now, with the removal of those legendary lords, it has achieved a great deal of success as an area, as a zone in the game. Cafe would be in a better spot and would take the #1 spot if they had more legendary lords, a couple more legendary lords. It's just a bit too large and too safe, really, for what it is at the moment. Whereas Lustria is just right in a lot of respects, with the exception of not having the same kind of diversity of terrain as Cafe. But outside of that, yeah, it's in a really great state as a zone, as an area. And that's all there is to say. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and I'll see you next time.